Yeah, good afternoon and welcome to the Cryosphere Pavilion. My name is Christina and I'm a geophysicist at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. And I'm one of the early career scientist volunteers here at the pavilion. And I would like to introduce our next session here, which is entitled From Global Glacier Monitoring to the Global Glacier Casualty List. And our first speaker will be Michael Zemp, Director of WGMS, the World Glacier Monitoring Service. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks a lot to host us here in this event. This is all about glaciers, the more than 275,000 glaciers that are spread around the periphery of the ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica, but all over the Arctic and also high mountain Asia and in many of the mountain regions of this world. This is about glaciers and how they changed from being an icon of climate change and more becoming memorials of our success in halting global warming. It is a joint presentation of the World Glacier Monitoring Service with the Global Glacier Casualty List project and the Glacier Global Model Comparison project. So we have here today with us on site David Rounds, that will speak at the end. Then we have Jimmy Holm and Dominic Boyer from Rice University virtually, and myself, Michael Zemp. I start actually off as a director of the World Glacier Monitoring Service and try to start with the observations. What do we know from observations? Well, being at the climate conference on discussions here, you have heard probably about climate is changing, right? And when you talk about observations, it might be good to remind us what is actually going on. And what you see here from the last IPCC report is the global warming that we did see since pre-industrial times. The global average warmed by about 1.5 degrees by today, and we are talking about another 1 to 6 degrees, depending on further emissions that we're going to release by the end of this century. Of course, that has an impact, and glaciers are reacting on that. In fact, glaciers are one of the best natural indicators of climate change because they are able to translate a relatively small change in temperature, such as 1/10 of a degree over a decade, into a clearly visible and basically understandable signal of glacier retreat by hundreds of meters or even kilometers. So global climate is changing, but also globally glaciers are melting. And what you can see here in this heat map basically is the global glacier mass change from 1976 until 2023. Blue stripes are years in where globally glaciers could gain mass, and red, of course, are years where glaciers were melting and losing mass at the global level. And you can see that in the first year in the 70s and 80s, we had years with slight mass gain and years with slight mass loss. But then since the 1990s, the thing is getting more and more red, and we have hunting records of global glacier mass loss year by year. Of course, this is not a linear process. Climate change is complex and glaciers are complex as well. So if you take 2023, which was the most negative year for glaciers, you can see that glaciers did not lose everywhere the same amount of ice. But first of all, it might be worthwhile to note that 2023, the globe is red all over. So it was one of the first years where actually glaciers were losing mass in all mountain regions. But you can see that like in the Pyrenees, in the European Alps, but also Western North America, we had the most red parts. This is where glaciers were losing most of their mass. Whereas in the Canadian Arctic, Russian Arctic, or also in the Kunlun, Karakoram region, the red is a bit lighter. So there they suffered a bit less than in other regions. If you pile up all these annual mass changes of glaciers, then you can see this curve of cumulative glacier mass change at the global level from 1976 to present. And you see that the situation was kind of balanced. Glaciers were close to a steady state in the 70s, 80s. But then we see this drastic, rapid increase in mass loss of more than 8,000 gigatons globally by 2023. 8,000 gigatons is something hard to imagine. It's just a big number with many digits. But if you would produce a nice block out of that, it would have the size of Germany and a thickness of more than 25 meters. So quite a dramatic amount of fresh water that we lost since the 70s. Why do we know that? Why do we have these numbers? This is thanks to 130 years of internationally coordinated glacier monitoring. So it all started actually in the 19th century with the question of the formation of ice ages. Why were glaciers growing? Is it local or regional climate, or is it extraterrestrial forcing? And at that time, glaciologists realized they need three things to solve the problem. They cannot look just at a few glaciers for a few years, but they need to have long time series, more than 30 years to see climate and not just weather. They need to do it for many glaciers around the world. And third, they have to share the data to solve the problem. And that's how it all started off. Of course, nowadays, it's still about climate, but it's more about the anthropogenic warming of the globe and the related melting of the glaciers. All the data that the World Glacier Monitoring Service is hosting and sharing is actually collected through our network of national correspondents in more than 40 countries. And we are compiling in annual calls for data the in situ measurements from about 500 glaciers around the world. But of course, nowadays as well, the remote sensing data that allow us to get observations from basically all the more than 275,000 glaciers worldwide. Today, we're also going to have, after these presentations and the discussion, a deeper insight into glacier changes in Iceland from our colleagues from Iceland. We will come back to that at a later stage. So all of this data is free and open available through the World Glacier Monitoring Service. So we can get access directly to the database. You can load it into your local geographic information system and analyze it. What we are doing here is basically we combine these in situ measurements together with the remote sensing data and then scale it up to get a global assessment of glacier mass changes in all the regions for every year. And this is how we get to this global stripe that you did see. Based on that, well, glaciers, I said already, are one of the main indicators of climate change. They are showing that it's really happening. But it's also a drastic change of our mountain regions. So with the glacier melt, our mountains turn from the old eternal places of ice to rather debris-covered deserts. But it also has direct impact downstreams. So on local hazard situation, on regional water availability, on global water storage, the global heat inventory, but also, of course, at the end, global sea level rise. So you could say what happens on the glacier doesn't stay on the glacier, but reaches downstream, even down to the coasts and the sea. I did show you the global results, but we have the same thing, of course, for all the 19 regions that are covered with glaciers. And if you look here, you can see again that in the 70s, 80s, we have these blue spots. So years where the glaciers were doing well in a few regions, but then the picture turns more and more red to the right side. And in fact, 22 and 23 were the first years where we get observations from melting glaciers in all the 19 regions. You see on the top right, you see this very dark red spot. And this is Central Europe, where the 2 past years were so extreme that in 2 years only, we lost 10% of the remaining ice. You can do the same story for all the 19 regions, and you compare how much ice is still left in each region and how much is melting every single year. And this is what this figure here shows. So on the y-axis, we have the annual ice loss in percentage of the remaining ice volume. So between 0 and 3% of the total of the remaining ice loss per year. And when you look at the different regions, then we have 5 where we lose between 1 and 3% of the remaining ice every single year. So in the Western North America, Central Europe, Caucasus, in the tropics and in New Zealand. You can make the calculations yourself. It's pretty obvious. If these melt rates are continuing, the glaciers in these regions don't have a chance to survive the present century. But what that means actually, you're going to hear from my colleagues from the Rice University.
Great. Thank you, Mikhail. Should we move to the next slide, I think? Yes, great. Hello, everyone. Dominic Boyer and my name is Simony Howe. Dominic Boyer and I are anthropologists at Rice University, and we've been working in collaboration with the World Glacier Monitoring Service, as well as a number of other partners over the last year to develop what we're calling the Global Glacier Casualty List. And we'd invite you to look that up on the URL. You can put in the name of a Global Glacier Casualty List in order to find that online, because it is an interactive platform. The motivation behind the Global Glacier, we're not ready for that quite yet. The motivation behind the Global Glacier Casualty List was just what Mikhail said at the beginning of his presentation. The world is becoming red all over. And what we recognized in our work with communities all over the world who live in cryospheric regions, who live near glaciers, is that glaciers are not just retreating, as Michael just pointed out, but they're actually disappearing entirely. That is, they could be said to be dying. And this is a kind of a new moment. This is a new phenomenon, a pivot point in what we're seeing in terms of climate change impacts and how it's affecting not just glaciers, but human communities who live near those glaciers. So with the global glacier casualties, what we're recognizing is that since the year 2000, global warming has led to the disappearance of thousands of glaciers across the world. At first, many of these glaciers were small, but now we are seeing larger glaciers melting, many with vital cultural and economic and environmental importance to the communities and human populations who live near them. So the Global Glacier Casualty List has been made in order to remember their names, the names of these glaciers, and also to begin to tell their stories. And I want to remind people that a casualty list is a list usually of people who are lost in war. When we think of a casualty list, we think of those people who have been lost in human conflict, who have died. But a casualty list is also those people who've been injured in a conflict, but who haven't died yet. And we think that this is a really important distinction, because one of the things we want to highlight in the casualty list is that while many of the world's glaciers are disappearing and dying, we also have an opportunity to save those that remain. And so they may be injured, but we still have the capacity to save them. Now we can move on to the next slide. So this is a collaboration between the arts and sciences and civil society organizations to try and raise awareness about these glacier losses and also to catalyze change. So we don't want to create these platforms just to have another platform to scare people, to make them anxious and worried about the changing cryosphere, about the impacts of climate change. We want to draw attention, but we also want to catalyze change. We want to motivate people to make changes in their daily lives, to lobby their governments, to encourage more massive changes at larger and larger scales. So we're building from a whole system and a whole series of other arts interventions, like films that we've been seeing coming out over the last couple of decades. You see a few of them listed here. Things like the Glacier Initiative in Switzerland, and the memorials for glaciers that we have been seeing in many places around the world. So these are all ways to encourage conversation around the loss of glaciers and conversation about how we can make important interventions and changes to try and turn the tide, if you will, on the end of glaciers that we're seeing globally. We can go to the next slide. So much of this, the impetus for the Global Glacier Casualty List began in many ways with a memorial that we hosted along with collaborators in Iceland for the first Icelandic glacier to be lost to climate change. In 2019, there was much news around the world about Ökjökull, which had actually been lost and declared dead in 2014, but there had been very little recognition globally, or even in the country of Iceland, where this glacier had died, had been lost. There was very little recognition. And as cultural anthropologists who were doing research in Iceland at the time, we felt it was important to draw attention to these kinds of losses, to these threshold events. So when we use ritual and we use culture, we believe that we can create different kinds of empathy, different kinds of understanding. That empathy and understanding can only work when we're working in collaboration with scientists like those at the WGMS and other glaciologists around the world. But telling the story and being able to engage these ritual forms, we think is very important. So here we're bringing together the physical sciences of glaciology and the social sciences of anthropology, and trying to see the ways that we can use ritual and culture in order to make an impact and to make a difference in messaging to larger populations around the world. And so many of you may remember this little funeral that we had on top of Oak Mountain in August of 2019, a letter to the future that was penned by our Icelandic colleague, Andrés Magnusson, about the loss of Ökjökull. That was a powerful message, and that was part of the impulse behind creating this Global Glacier Casualty List. We go to the next one. Thank you, Mikael. So this is a platform. As I said, it's an online platform that you can search through any search engine. It is a platform for communicating the human stakes of disappearing glaciers. I want to emphasize that it is global in nature. And so we've been very intentional about representing glacier loss, glacier casualties, those glaciers that are dead or injured around the world. And on this platform, you can go in with your browser and you can see the initial set of glaciers that we have on the platform. There are 15 of them. They're from every continent on Earth that has glaciers. And you can spin this globe and you can use your mouse to toggle in, and you can click on each of these spots that show you the glacier that is endangered. And it gives you a three-dimensional view of the region around that glacier. You can actually see some of the mountain ranges and the different topography that surrounds the glacier. These are all satellite images. So you get a very good impression of what that glacier space looks like and what the terrain is around there as you click on the globe. When you click on the left-hand side, you see this list of the glaciers. So here's, can you click on it? Is it active? You can look at Auswitok is a glacier in the Canadian Arctic. So this is a glacier that is endangered. It's not dead yet, but it's right near an indigenous community. And it's been a very important glacier for people in this region. So when you click on this particular story or any of the stories here, you will get a rendering of the stories that people tell around this region and why these glaciers are important to them, what kinds of histories they hold, what sorts of folk legends they might have, what are the important elements that make them important. Perhaps they're important for tourism, perhaps they're important for accessing hunting regions. Each of the glaciers we found in working with community partners who live near and around these glaciers, and in working with the glaciologists who study these glaciers in each part of, in all over the world, have actually shown us that each of these glaciers have their own unique personalities. They have their own unique stories to tell. Okay, I think we could go to the next one. So here's an example of what the story will look like, what the story looks like inside each of these narratives. This is really a blend of scientific information as well as cultural storytelling. And again, it's told by those who know these glaciers best. So each of these stories come from the communities. We've been working very closely to gather these stories and work with those people who live near and around them. And they tell different features about, for example, training young people. Here you see a picture of Dagu Glacier in China. Here they're training young people how to do glacier monitoring. And so in some cases, these glaciers are becoming educational sites for youth to be able to understand the major changes to the cryosphere. And you'll read many of the details. For example, this astonishing figure that China has lost over 8,000 glaciers that have completely disappeared. So there's many important facts that are contained in these short narratives, but there's also important cultural, historical, and information that is shared in each of these packages of stories as well. So we'll turn it over to Dominic now.
Can you hear me now? So, as somebody was saying, each of these case studies identifies different aspects of why glaciers matter to people and blends in different forms of scientific information as well as local cultural narratives and cultural concerns. And in many cases, the partnerships to produce these profiles come through collaborations with scientists, with writers, with people, mountaineers, people who know these glaciers and these mountains very well. And so in honor of the fact that 2025 has been named by the United Nations as the International Year of Glaciers Preservation, we're planning now on expanding beyond our initial 15 profiles. So there may be people listening right now who are interested in developing a profile for this project, and we would encourage you to reach out to us if you do. This example from Pico Humboldt Glacier is maybe more on the cultural end of things. It focuses on the legends of the 5 white eagles that were once representing Venezuela's 5 mountain glaciers, all of which have now disappeared. So Venezuela may be the first country to have lost all its glaciers, although Slovenia also has a claim to that as well too. So we're now entering, as somebody said, into a new phase where we're not only losing ice, losing individual glaciers, but whole aspects of the cryospheric heritage of different countries are beginning to disappear. Mikhail, could you advance the slide? So as a way of helping to draw further attention to this project and as well to think about ways that we can move off of the virtual internet-based platform and into sort of more performative real-world events of the kind that we did in Iceland 5 years ago, we organized a glacier graveyard in Iceland this past August together with collaborators from the University of Iceland and the Iceland Meteorological Office. And that was an effort to create an actual performance based upon these 15 glaciers. We had Iceland's lone ice carver Otto Magnusson carving gravestones out of ice. We hired an Icelandic funeral choir to deliver a proper set of songs, and we gathered together and read eulogies for each of these glaciers. The eulogies were based upon the profiles that were developed in the Global Glacier Casualty List. Mikhail, if you could advance one more slide. And you see here, as in the case of Kilimanjaro, by distilling these stories down, by removing some of the scientific facts, Mikhail pointed out earlier that sometimes when you're talking about billions of tons of glacier ice being lost in a year, it's a very abstract, it's almost an unfathomable number. And by taking us away from the numbers and towards something that I think people can intuitively understand, it's hard to understand 8 billion tons of ice are lost, but people understand what a funeral is, and they've heard a eulogy before. So in a sense, by trying to meet audiences halfway to appeal also to the emotional stakes of these losses, in addition to the scientific stakes and the economic stakes and so on, we think there's a way to sort of create an emotional connection to these issues that may over time help to encourage an acceleration of the right kinds of behaviors and the right kinds of decisions, political pressure to make decisions towards decarbonization, for example, more quickly. Next slide. And we found that by doing the graveyard, we were actually successful in helping to also generate media interest. Media are interested in novel events. They're interested in things that are unprecedented. So the fact of a glacier graveyard was something that generated a certain amount of media interest, including a story in the Washington Post and several European public broadcasters, and in France's daily newspaper for children, the Petit Quotidien, which is a great way to again take these scientific facts and bring them to a broader audience, again by thinking carefully about the medium through which we approach people, the taking very seriously the arts of storytelling, and also by building a collaboration that makes sure things are rooted in fact, but are also aware of and appreciative of the cultural stakes of these losses. So last slide, Mika. And this is the team behind the project. Simone and I are co-leads. You see our email addresses there. Again, if you'd like to reach out with an idea for a glacier profile, we'd encourage you to do so. We're actively recruiting new stories at the moment. But in addition, we have a wonderful scientific advisory board you see there that is closely connected to the World Glacier Monitoring Service, to UNESCO, to the Icelandic Glaciological Society, the University of Iceland, and of course our home university, Rice University, which has agreed to maintain this platform in perpetuity. So I'll leave it there and turn I think we're turning it over to David now.
Yeah, thank you both for that wonderful, really moving stories about our glaciers and why they matter, both from a societal aspect and also from their contributions to sea level rise and all of these other factors. Really why everybody should care, right? Everybody, we are all part of our global society, and we really highlight that here. For the next 10 minutes, I'm going to talk a little bit as a role sort of as an ambassador for the Glacier Modeling and Comparison Project. Next slide, yeah, perfect. Where we start to think about how are the glaciers changing in the future. We've heard already how they're changing in the past and how we've now entered this really unprecedented time where the last year was the first time that all glaciers were melting, right? Every glacier that was monitored was melting, as Michael showed. But really we want to understand, is that going to continue in the future? Or is that going to change? And as you can see by our temperatures increasing, I think it's pretty obvious, but you might be asking yourself, how much? And that's what we'll talk about. Next slide. So one of the most exciting things that came out of really in the last couple of decades has been the proliferation of satellite images. And these satellite images give us a remarkable sense as to how all the glaciers on our planet are responding to climate change. So this was a study that came out 3 years ago, and it measured every single one of our glaciers, more than 200,000 glaciers. It measured every single one of them. How much on average is that glacier thinning? And it did it all over the world. And so you can see in the red colors here, you see almost about a meter of thinning per year between 2000 and 2019. You do see, as Michael had stated earlier, that not all glaciers thin at the same amount. And there are even some, he referenced the Karakoram anomaly, that center part of high mountain Asia, that during this time period, they had pretty much no elevation change, or in some places, slight elevation gain. We start to see in more recent years, those have started to thin as well, but it does highlight the spatial variations that we have. And what's really exciting from a modeler perspective is we can start to utilize these data, and in order to try to improve how well we can predict what these glaciers will look like in the future. Next slide, please. And so here's what those global glacier projections look like. So we do this for a variety of different general circulation models and for various shared socioeconomic pathways. These are really allowing us to think about what's going to happen if we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions or if we don't. And so you can see here a really drastic range. If we don't reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, we're looking at SSP 585 losing approximately 45% of our glaciers. However, if we take action here while we can, we need to do this quick. We need to do this now. We can get back on track to one of those SSP 126 scenarios, gets us closer to that 1.5 degree increase in temperature change relative to pre-industrial levels. And we can save 27 or 17% of our glaciers, right? We're going to lose approximately 27% of our glaciers. What that means is some amount of glacier mass loss is already baked into the system. But look at the difference in that number, 17%. Our actions here, our actions as a global society can have an impact on preserving our glaciers. Next slide, please. And so the other thing that I want to highlight is that we are in this cadence of IPCC assessment reports that typically inform policy. But those assessment reports come out, on a regular schedule, but there are lots of really interesting studies that come out in between. And so this is an example of multiple studies that have come out. The plot is showing one study that was published last year. Since that time, there's been another study that came out 2 weeks ago that essentially confirmed those same estimates, but with more glacier models. And they all show approximately 10 to 15% more mass loss than previous glacier model intercomparison efforts. So what that means is that the assessment report values are actually underestimating how much the glaciers are projected to lose in the future based off of our new knowledge now. Next slide, please. Now, one of the things that we like to do is to take our models and make them policy relevant. And one of the ways that we can do that is instead of thinking about these emission scenarios, we can think about our temperature change scenarios. And so that's what we've done here. We've done that translation from emission scenarios to temperature scenarios. And you can see the clear difference. So at the top panel, you see between 2020 and 2100, how the glacier mass is going to evolve. You see similar numbers, about 25% glacier mass loss globally for that 1.5 degree temperature change scenario, up to a little over 40% for a 4 degree temperature change scenario. The plot on the top right, you can very clearly see if you fit a line between these, it's roughly linear. What that shows us is that every reduction in temperature matters. Every 1/10 of a degree matters in helping to preserve our glaciers. On the bottom panel, you can see the number of glaciers. So this is how many glaciers are being lost. And you can see here that even in a best case scenario, we're going to lose roughly 50% of our glaciers, even in a best case scenario. If we get to higher temperature scenarios like 3 degrees or 4 degrees, we're losing on the order of 70 to 80% of our glaciers globally. That is a staggering number, right? So once again, we have the ability to keep them off of that casualty list, 20 to 30% of our glaciers around the world. Next slide, please. And what I also want to highlight is that this isn't just a problem for high mountain communities or those who rely on these for water resources. All coastal communities are going to be impacted by this. In fact, they already are being impacted by this due to sea level rise. Glaciers currently contribute approximately 20% of the global mean sea level rise. And so here you can see as we look into the future, they're still going to continue to contribute. On the order for a 1.5 degree scenario, the glaciers are estimated to contribute an additional 90 millimeters of sea level. When we get to higher temperature change scenarios, we're looking at increasing up to 100 for 2 degrees and even as much as about 150 millimeters for that 4 degree scenario. Once again, our actions today, now, can make the difference between 90 millimeters and 150 millimeters. That is huge, and that is only a fifth of the contribution to global mean sea level. Next slide, please. If we think about these numbers, what that means is that every 1/10 of a degree reduces the glacier's contributions to sea level rise by 2.5 millimeters. That may not sound like a lot, but that is huge. That is the difference in how severe storm surges can be and how much capability different coastal communities have to adapt in the future. Next slide, please. Now, what I've shown you so far is what happens on a global scale. But as we know, and the stories that we've seen and the measurements that were shared before this, we see that these glaciers are really regionally specific. And so the response really varies depending on the region where these glaciers are located. Next slide, please. Now, I first want to highlight the mid-latitude regions. What you see here is you see a sharp decrease between 1.5 and 3 degrees. And then it levels out. And the reason is quite clear. It levels out because there's almost no more ice to lose, right? So these mid-latitude regions are incredibly sensitive to the difference between 1.5 degrees and 3 degrees. They are incredibly sensitive to our actions here. We can make a difference in preserving the ice in these areas. That is on us. Next slide, please. Much larger regions, you see this very linear relationship, and that's because there's a lot of ice there. And what that means is that, once again, our actions have an impact, but there's also going to be a decent amount of ice remaining, which means that these glaciers are going to continue to contribute to sea level rise well beyond 2100 as well. Next slide, please. Now, one of the most exciting things that we looked at earlier was how we now have this view as to how much all of our more than 200,000 glaciers are thinning. And we can do the same exact thing now with our models because we calibrated our models using that data. And so, Michael, I'm going to ask you to click back and forth 3 times and then click back 3 times and forward 3 times. Now, what you're looking at here is the red colors are areas where the glaciers have less than 20% of their glacier mass remaining by the end of the century. The blue colors are showing you where there's approximately more than 80% remaining by the end of the century, and the yellows are in between. We also highlight here the difference where you lose your glaciers completely. Those are the white glaciers, or the white circles that are outlined in black. So Michael, if you could click through. You can see here as Michael clicks through at 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees, things are getting much darker red. And the amount of those white circles is greatly, greatly increasing. If you go back, Michael, and forward again. I want to draw your attention, for example, to Alaska here on the left, right? You see really dark red areas and a lot of deglaciation. Again, it's not just the mid-latitudes that are going to have areas of deglaciation. Almost all glacier regions are going to experience some amount of deglaciation, but we have the ability to take action and make a difference here. You can move on to the next slide, Michael. Thank you. So why do we care about these? We've talked a lot about the cultural significance, which is really incredible, and I think we need more of. These glaciers are also absolutely beautiful. It's one of the most amazing things and the most privileged things that we have to be a glaciologist is that our laboratory are these locations, these majestic, beautiful areas of our planet. And a lot of people get to see these as well. This is an example of Marjorie Glacier located in Glacier Bay National Park in Alaska. It's one of the most frequently visited glaciers in the US because a bunch of cruise ships come up and they look at this glacier. They get to see it's a tidewater glacier, which means the ice flows into the ocean and they can see the beauty of ice calving into the water, right? Next slide, please. We now have the ability to look at what is this glacier going to look like in the future. We can project how it's going to vary for different temperature change scenarios. And what you can see is there's very little variance between 2050, but then after 2050 is where our actions today start to have a really big impact, 1.5 degrees versus 4 degrees. Now, unfortunately, our projections show that this glacier is going to actually retreat out of the ocean and terminate onto land. That is more or less inevitable based off of our model projections. But we have the ability for it to be close to the ocean so that people can still come back and see it versus it really retreating up to a higher area where it's hoping to find a new equilibrium. It's hoping to move out of to higher and higher elevations so that it can reach colder temperatures and become happy again. But if we are able to curtail our greenhouse gas emissions, if we're able to keep that temperature increase to 1.5 degrees, it can be happier at much lower elevations where we can go and visit it and enjoy it. Next slide, please. Here's an example of Khumbu Glacier in the Nepal. This is where, on the Nepali side, if you're summiting Everest, this is where Everest Base Camp is located. What I really want to highlight here is that it's going to have a huge impact on some of the most iconic trekking and expedition routes in the world, right? If you look at our projections between 1.5 degrees and 4 degrees, 1.5 degrees more or less keeps ice flowing through the Khumbu icefall. It keeps ice getting almost towards that Everest Base Camp area. When we get to a 3 or a 4 degree scenario, we're starting to see the ice retreating up the Khumbu icefall. It would be very strange to think about the Khumbu icefall, this really iconic part of our world, not having any ice. Next slide, please. And the last story that I want to share is about Ka Roimato Hinehukatere, which is a glacier, that's its Maori name, in New Zealand. And this glacier has an incredible oral tradition that really moved me the first time that I heard it, so I want to share it with you. This glacier is the story of Hinehukatere, who she took her lover Tuabe up into the mountains, and Tuabe was not able to keep up with her and ended up falling and being swept down into an avalanche to his death. And Hinehukatere, she cried and she cried and she cried. And the gods, as a memorial to her tears, they froze them as a perpetual memorial. And so Ka Roimato Hinehukatere in Maori is the tears of the avalanche maiden. So just as we talked about the power of stories, right? These glaciers are just not important only for their majesty and their beauty, not because of their contributions to sea level rise, but also because of the stories that they share and will continue to share and be passed on as a part of cultures, and hopefully to our children and children and children beyond that. Next slide, please. And here's just a wonderful example. What happens in the future? We see a huge difference between 1.5 degrees, where the glacier is going to retreat a little bit, but start to stabilize at much, much lower elevations, right? We're estimating that it'll lose approximately 30% of its mass. But if we have those higher emission scenarios, if we have those higher temperature change scenarios, we're looking at losing on the order of 80–90% of this glacier. And I think, Michael, if you could actually go back one slide, please. I think it's really important. A Maori individual stated it better than I think anybody could. It's more than just a physical loss. It's a spiritual depletion, a depletion of our ancestral heritage, and a devaluation of our past. You can move forward, Michael. I believe I'm all set. Thanks.
Yes, and maybe coming to the end of our presentation here, we did show you that we can see, unfortunately, the dramatic loss of glaciers from observations. We did tell you the stories that for many glaciers, it's too late, they're gone. We have to adjust to the changes that are coming, but we did just hear from David that it's not hopeless, so we can still save them. And it's really like maybe you have to flip the things around in our mind. So it's not only every increase in temperature matters because there's so much loss, it's also the other way. Every decrease in temperature matters because with every 1/10 of a degree that we can stop global warming, we're gonna save some glaciers and avoid the downstream problems that this is causing. So it is time to act, and time to act is now. It is now at the COP29. I hope you can make a little step forward to the change we need, but it's also 2025. We're going to have the International Year of Glaciers Preservation. And from my personal point of view, this is not about covering glaciers with a fleece or a cover. It's really about reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. And we're just entering actually in a decade of actions for the cryospheric sciences, which is really a call to act. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention. And I think we can move forward to questions and discussions. And after that, we're going to have this video contribution from the Icelandic glaciers.
Any questions? Yes, Martin.
Thank you, Dave. That was all brilliant. Thank you, everybody online as well. Really super. Of course, things don't stop at 2100. And when you were talking about preservation, when we were talking about preservation of some of the glaciers, I suspect that even some of them that had a little bit of ice left at 2100 probably won't, maybe just 10 or 20 years after that. Have you done any projections into 2150 and beyond at all?
Yeah, that's a great question, Martin. And I swear I didn't cue that up. But on the Toblerones behind us around the pavilion, you can actually see the projections that go out to 2300.
Yeah, I read those.
And what you find actually is that with a 1.5-degree scenario, for example, in Central Europe, you actually see some of the glaciers actually starting to grow. They're not growing back to 100%, but they're dipping down to 30%, and they're coming back up to 40%, right? So our actions can have a really big impact, and it varies by region, as you might expect, but I encourage you to check those out. Other questions? I think they're ready for the video, Michael.
Okay, good. For the video, this is not in my power. So I thank you again for everybody there. And I leave it to the local organizers to start the video. And I stop sharing my own screen.
Global average surface temperature with peaking at in 2023, as we all know. This runs from 1880. The upper panel. Good afternoon from Reykjavik, Iceland, where the winter is arriving with sub-zero temperatures. I guess you are enjoying somewhat warmer temperatures down in Baku. Nice to be with you today. My name is Thorsteinn Thorsteinsson, and I'm giving this presentation on behalf of a larger group of glaciologists working at the Icelandic Meteorological Office, at the Institute of Earth Sciences, University of Iceland, at the National Power Company, and then we all come together in the Icelandic Glaciological Society to compare our results. Now, Iceland is, as you know, located high up in the north, just under the Arctic Circle, and we actually enjoy quite mild temperatures for the latitude. The average annual temperature is 12 degrees Celsius higher than the latitudinal average. Latitude is between 63.5 and 66.5, and this blessing is due to the Gulf Stream. A branch of it encircles Iceland and brings with it rather mild sort of temperatures during winter, and but also cool summers, and also brings precipitation that feeds the glaciers in Iceland. Now you can see on the left, the upper panel shows the mean annual temperatures, about 6 degrees along the south coast, -7 at highest elevations inland, where the large ice caps are located. The interior is of course uninhabited and uninhabitable, only sandy deserts and lavas and ice caps. Precipitation is relatively high, average 1800 millimeters, much higher along the south coasts, and at the highest elevations on the glaciers it's typical to have more than 10 meters of winter snow at the end of winter. But there's a precipitation shadow north of the ice caps in the central highlands. If we look on the right in the lower panel, that's the global average surface temperature with peaking at in 2023, as we all know. This runs from 1880. The upper panel shows decadal averages for Iceland, or one station, or average of 7 stations in Iceland. You can see there are ups and downs, but there is a long-term warming trend, of course. But over the last 10-15 years, it has leveled off a little bit after a very rapid increase after 1995. Here's an overview of Iceland and the main ice caps, and every time a presentation is given, the areas have to be, figures on the areas have to be updated because of the rapid retreat. Of course, we had, we have totally, in total we have 10% glacier cover on Iceland. We had country fully glaciated, of course, during the last glacial maximum. No ice cover during the Holocene thermal maximum, but the present ice caps had probably formed by 2,500 years ago. Smaller though they were in the start. And these ice caps are natural wonders, natural laboratories for science, sources of renewable energy, because a large part of the hydropower used in Iceland is produced in plants on glacial rivers, and they are increasingly a playground for tourists. The existence of these ice caps is definitely threatened by global warming, as we shall see. Now, the proximity to the glaciers throughout recorded history has caused difficulties, of course, because the glacial rivers were obstacles to travel, and glaciers like the Breiðamerkurjökull, shown on the right, they would, during the Little Ice Age, override farmland that have been used since the 10th century. You can access historical photos on the Icelandic glacier portal indicated here, and data on mass balance and front variations. But this proximity to the glaciers also meant that both farmers and landmen could make very important observations that are detailed in some treatises written by people like Þórður Þorkelsson Ídalín, who discussed mechanisms of glacier flow in a 17th century treatise. And even more important is the Jöklaritið, or a treatise by Sveinn Pálsson, naturalist and physician who traveled widely to observe and study glaciers, and made a very important observation where he described glacier ice as viscous fluid flowing under the influence of gravity downslope. Now, when we enter the 20th century, we start to get the first regular observation programs established, and one of the first glaciologists to work in Iceland, he initiated a collaboration with people all over Iceland from all walks of life, farmers, teachers, nurses, carpenters, and asked them simply to visit a particular glacier at the end of summer each year and record its position relative to some benchmark. Out of this grew a data set for 40-50 glaciers that is still being added to, and it even runs in families. You can see the front variation for one of the outlets of Snæfellsjökull here depicted on the graph. And I believe there's a father and son and grandson that have been making this data set by visiting a particular outlet for almost a century by now. You can see figures here on retreat and demise in the area of Snæfellsjökull, which is the only ice cap that can be seen with the naked eye from Reykjavik. Now, here are more pictures. The well-known Múlajökull, outlet glacier from the Hofsjökull ice cap in central Iceland. It is only a shadow of its former glory as a Piedmont glacier, featured in many textbooks and on journal covers. And then there are small glaciers in northern Iceland disappearing, in the mountainous regions there, disappearing every year. Retreat also leads to the formation of new proglacial or marginal lakes, like the one seen on the lower right by the margin of the Langjökull ice cap, and these new lakes can create jökullaup or glacier outburst flood hazards that need to be monitored. In addition to the program by the Glaciological Society is a new collaboration with American photographer James Baylock to document and communicate glacier changes and create a photo archive and visual legacy for the future. And this is done in collaboration with the Glaciological Society here and with guides and photographers and other people. And these pictures are from the Skaftafellsjökull outlet glacier from southern Vatnajökull. Now, not only the front variations are being measured, but the outlines of the major ice caps are being recorded and from satellite imagery on a regular basis by now. And there is also data and on the outlines from the entire 20th century, and starting often at the end of the Little Ice Age, moraines that formed then. Then maps come into play and aerial photographs and LiDAR data, and then satellite images. So now we have quite a good information about area changes in Iceland since the end of the Little Ice Age in 1819. So you can see here a decline from 12,600 square kilometers to 10,100 last year. This is more than 20% loss of the area. Typical annual retreat of the fronts is between 20 and 100 meters, and every year about 40 square kilometers of land surface emerges from beneath retreating glaciers in Iceland. Not only the area is being monitored and delivered to international bodies like WGMS and GLIMS, the measurement of glacier thickness on radio echo sounding lines has been a project ongoing for decades here in Iceland under the leadership of Eddie Björnsson and his colleagues, and they have actually been able to determine the volume of ice caps in Iceland through thorough measurements. And depicted here are the figures at the time of measurement and also estimates from 2019. So the currently estimated total volume of glacier ice in Iceland is closing in on 3,300 cubic kilometers, which is equivalent to, or the sea level equivalent is 9 millimeters. And these data, of course, on volume have been used to determine parameters in the volume area scaling relation that is often used to determine volume when only data on the area is available. Now, when we have the volume, then of course we would like to know the volume changes from year to year, and this is done by conducting traditional mass balance measurements at more than 100 points on the 4 main ice caps: Vatnajökull, Hofsjökull, Langjökull, and Mýrdalsjökull. And the institutes carry this out with support from the Glaciological Society. We drill through the winter layer, we measure the density, we determine the water equivalent thickness, we determine the winter balance for the ice cap as a whole. We put on ablation stakes in the spring and revisit in the autumn to measure how much has been lost by melting, and then we calculate the annual balance. But this is maybe, for example, for the Hofsjökull ice cap done at only 20-point locations. So every few years there are LiDAR campaigns to determine the surface very thoroughly, very carefully over the entire area. Not all the ice cap area is accessible to ground-based measurements because of crevasses. So the LiDAR results derive or yield very good geodetic results on mass balance comparisons between 2 campaigns, and that helps us to correct for biases in the ground-based data that are inevitably there. Now, what are the results? Here is one example that actually gives a good indication of what it is for the other ice caps as well. This is from the Hofsjökull ice cap in Iceland, where these measurements have been going on for 37 years. And the short story is that we've had mass loss in 32 years and mass gain in only 5 years. The annual mass balance for the last glacial year that ended now in October was minus 0.9 meters water equivalent, yet another negative year. We had a cool summer, but the winter balance was so low that this together gave us the end results that we are looking at here. And there are only 5 years with positive mass balance, with the year 2015 standing out. That was a year with very high precipitation during the winter and a cool summer after that. And you can see here the figures for area demise of Hofsjökull since the end of the Little Ice Age. This ice cap has lost about 15% of its volume since 1995, but all the ice caps in Iceland combined have probably lost around 7% of their total volume since 1995. And here is additional data and graphics on this mass loss through this period from 1890 to 2020. And this is compared here with the climate curve or the mean summer temperature at one weather station, Stykkishólmur. Notice particularly the rapid warming in the 20s and in the 1990s. The short story take-home message from this is that the mass decline since 1890 went from 3,940 gigatons estimated down to 3,400 and closing in on 3,300 gigatons by now, as I said earlier. And the average annual mass loss since 1995 is 10 gigatons per year, and you can compare that with the average of 200 gigatons per year from the entire Greenland ice sheet over a similar period. And the sea level equivalent of ice in Iceland is, like I said before, 9 millimeters, and that can be compared with the sea level equivalent of all ice in the Himalayas, which is 11 millimeters. Now, the moderator of this session will be familiar with these data. He's the first author of the science paper that came out last year on projections for the world's glaciers until the end of this century. And they did this for all glaciated regions of the world. They sort of calculated what's in store for the glaciers given certain temperature and precipitation scenarios for Iceland. And let's look at the Hofsjökull ice cap again. If we manage to stick with the Paris Agreement, 1.5 degree warming, Hofsjökull is still going to lose 58% of its volume in the 21st century. But if we go for the 4 degree warming scenario, then it will lose 83% of its volume. The runoff is going to increase until the middle of this century, and then it will go on a decline after that. I cannot resist to mention that similar results actually were obtained here in Iceland and in a Nordic collaboration 15-20 years ago, when IPC scenarios of that time were downscaled for the Nordic region, and the effect on the glaciers calculated. Results for Hofsjökull at that time were quite comparable with these more recent results that I was just mentioning from Raunset et al. And the Icelandic National Power Company has seen the opportunity in this increased runoff until the middle of the century by installing in a new turbine in the Búrfell power station that can accommodate this increase in flow in the river and produce more energy thus. Coming to the end of the presentation, the Skeiðará bridge over the river Skeiðará could only be completed in 1974, and only then was it possible to drive all the way around Iceland. Before that, large jökullaups or glacier outburst floods had made that impossible. But now a kilometer-long bridge built over the Skeiðará River is standing on empty grounds and has been dismantled actually. The reason is that the river, due to the retreat of the glacier, which had been carving a valley, the river started hitting a sediment bank. It had been building up over centuries and millennia, and was diverted to a different location where it is flowing to the ocean. So that meant that actually there was no need for the bridge in that particular location anymore. So that was just one more example of how glacier changes are affecting societal infrastructure in Iceland. And with that, I will end my presentation, and I thank you for your attention. Very nice evening in Baku. Goodbye.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Have a nice evening.